The thunder of approaching hoofbeats broke the dawn silence at Fort Callaway. Sergeant Thomas Miller, standing watch at the eastern gate, squinted into the rising sun. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, then disappeared just as quickly. When the dust settled, only a small bundle remained on the weathered path leading to the fort. That bundle, wrapped in a faded quilt, would change the course of many lives within these walls, especially for Mason Reed, the fort's most reclusive scout, a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in nearly 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wyoming Territory, 1878 winter came early to Fort Callaway that year. The September winds carried a bitter chill that promised a harsh season ahead for the remote military outpost, nestled between the rolling plains and the jagged mountain range. The fort stood as the last bastion of civilization before the untamed wilderness, a place where only the most hardened soldiers were stationed. Sergeant Thomas Miller pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he paced the eastern watchtower. At 43, Miller had spent more than half his life in the army, and the creaking in his joints told the story of too many cold nights on watch. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in hues of amber and gold when he spotted movement. "On the horizon, rider approaching," he called out, more from habit than necessity. At this hour, most of the fort still slumbered. The lone figure advanced at a gallop, silhouetted against the rising sun. Miller reached for his rifle, though there was little cause for alarm. Hostilities had ceased in this region months ago, and travelers, while rare, weren't unheard of. But then something peculiar happened. The rider slowed about 100 yards from the gate, dismounted briefly, and then turned back, disappearing into the distance as quickly as they had appeared. "What is tarnation?" Miller muttered, adjusting his spectacles. Something had been left behind, a small bundle at the side of the trail. Miller descended from his post with surprising agility for a man his age and approached the gate. "Jenkins, take over the watch," he ordered a young private who was making his morning rounds. "Something strange is happening out there," Miller ventured, cautiously beyond the gate, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. As he drew closer to the mysterious bundle, a sound carried on the wind stopped him cold, the unmistakable cry of an infant. "Good Lord above," he whispered, quickening his pace. The bundle was wrapped in a patchwork quilt, faded and worn but clean. Miller knelt beside it and carefully pulled back a corner of the fabric. A pair of bright blue eyes stared back at him, wide and alert despite the early hour. A baby girl, no more than a few months old, with wisps of auburn hair and cheeks reddened by the cold. "Who would leave you out here, little one?" Miller murmured, gathering the bundle carefully in his arms. The baby's cries subsided as she studied his weathered face with curious eyes. Tucked within the folds of the quilt was a folded piece of paper. Miller shifted the child in his arms and opened it with one hand. The handwriting was hurried but legible. "Her name is Emma. Her father died at Powder River. I cannot provide for her. Please find someone who can. May God forgive me." No signature, no further explanation, just a desperate plea from a mother with no other options. Miller looked down at the infant, who had grasped his finger with surprising strength. "Well, Emma," he said softly, "let's get you inside where it's warm." The fort was just beginning to stir as Miller carried Emma through the gates. A few soldiers paused in their morning duties, eyebrows raised at the unusual sight of their sergeant cradling. "A baby! Jenkins, fetch Dr. Winters," Miller ordered. "And someone inform Colonel Hamilton. We have a situation." The fort's infirmary was sparsely equipped, but meticulously maintained by Dr. Samuel Winters, a former Boston physician who had joined the army after losing his wife to consumption. The doctor was already awake, organizing his supplies for the day when Miller arrived with Emma. "Well, this is certainly a first," Winters remarked, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "Set her down here, Thomas." Miller placed Emma gently on the examination table, keeping one hand supportively behind her head. "Found her outside the gate," Miller explained, handing the note to the doctor. "Someone just left her there and rode off." Winters read the note, his expression grave. "Powder River," he murmured. "That battle was almost 6 months ago. She doesn't look more than 3, maybe 4 months old," Miller observed. "A posthumous child, then," Winters said softly, beginning his examination. "Her father likely never knew of her existence." Emma remained surprisingly calm as the doctor checked her over, cooing occasionally and watching the men with alert eyes. "She appears to be in good health," Winters concluded. "Well nourished, no signs of illness or mistreatment. Whoever her mother is, she cared for this child as best she could before." He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Before she ran out of options," Miller finished. The infirmary door swung open, and Colonel James Hamilton entered, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. At 56, Hamilton commanded respect not through volume or intimidation, but through a quiet dignity that permeated his every action. "I was informed we have an unusual visitor," he said, his eyes falling on Emma. "I see the reports weren't exaggerated." Miller and Winters explained the situation, while Hamilton listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. "This presents quite a dilemma," Hamilton said when they had finished. "Fort Callaway is no place for an infant. The nearest proper settlement is 8 days' ride, and winter's coming fast. We can't just send her away, sir," Miller protested. "Not with the weather turning." Hamilton sighed. "No, we certainly can't. We'll have to make arrangements here, at least until spring thaw allows for safer travel." He turned to Winters. "Doctor, what supplies will the child need?" While the men discussed logistics, Emma began to fuss, her small face scrunching up as her cries echoed through the room. "She's likely hungry," Winters said. "We'll need milk. Goat's milk would be best if the quartermaster can spare some." "I'll see to it," Miller offered, already heading for the door. "And we'll need someone to care for her," Hamilton added. "The men have their duties, and none of us are particularly qualified for childcare." Miller paused at the doorway. "Sarah Blackwood might help," he suggested. "Jenkins' wife. She arrived last month to join him at the fort." Hamilton nodded. "Make the inquiries, Sergeant. Offer additional rations as compensation if necessary." As Miller departed on his errand, Emma's cries grew more insistent. Winters attempted to soothe her, but his clinical touch did little to comfort the infant. "Perhaps she senses she's among strangers," Hamilton observed. The doctor smiled wryly. "Aren't we all strangers here, Colonel? Most of us are running from something or someone." Hamilton couldn't argue with that assessment. Fort Callaway had become a repository for soldiers who didn't quite fit elsewhere, men with skills the army needed, but personalities that chafed against the rigid hierarchy of more prestigious posts, men seeking solitude or redemption or simply a place where the past couldn't easily find them. Men like Mason Reed. Mason was returning from a 3-day scouting mission when he heard the baby's cries. He had approached the fort from the western ridge, preferring as always to avoid the main gate and the inevitable interactions it would require. At 32, Mason had spent 7 years as a scout for the army, the last 3 at Fort Callaway. He was renowned for his tracking abilities and intimate knowledge of the territory, but equally known for his taciturn nature. Some said he had been different once, more sociable, even friendly. But that was before Ash Creek, before he had led a cavalry unit into an ambush that left 17 men dead. Mason had been absolved of any negligence. The intelligence he'd received had been flawed, but he carried the weight of those deaths. Nonetheless, retreating into a silence that few attempted to penetrate, the sound of a baby crying at the fort was so incongruous that Mason initially thought he was imagining it. He secured his horse in the stable, nodding briefly to the stable boy, but offering no words, as was his custom. The boy had learned not to expect conversation from the scout. Mason intended to deliver his report to Colonel Hamilton and then retreat to his quarters at the edge of the fort grounds, a small cabin intentionally separate from the barracks where most soldiers resided. But the crying grew louder as he crossed the parade ground, drawing him almost unconsciously toward the infirmary. He paused at the door, listening to the voices within. Hamilton, Winters, and the increasingly distressed infant. Something stirred. In Mason, a memory so long buried he could barely recognize it. Before he could change his mind, he pushed the door open. The room fell silent except for Emma's cries. Hamilton and Winters stared at Mason, clearly surprised by his unexpected appearance. Mason rarely sought out company, and never without purpose. "Reed," Hamilton acknowledged with a nod, "you've returned earlier than expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Mason's eyes were fixed on the red-faced infant squirming on the examination table. Without responding to the colonel, he moved forward. His usual graceful stride somehow softened. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Winters and Hamilton exchanged glances of surprise but stepped aside. Mason carefully lifted Emma, supporting her head with practiced ease that belied his rugged appearance. He cradled her against his chest, one large hand patting her back in a gentle rhythm. Miraculously, Emma's cries began to subside. She hiccuped several times, then grew quiet, nestling against Mason's buckskin jacket. "Well, I'll be damned," Winters muttered, then quickly added, "Pardon my language, Colonel." Mason seemed oblivious to their astonishment. "She was left outside?" he asked, his eyes still on the infant. Hamilton nodded. "Just this morning. The mother left a note. Father died at Powder River, apparently." A shadow crossed Mason's face. He had scouted for that expedition, though he hadn't participated in the battle itself. Another weight to carry, another loss connected to his actions. "Her name's Emma," Winters offered, watching curiously as the scout continued to soothe the now quiet child. The door opened again as Sergeant Miller returned with a small container of milk and Sarah Blackwood in tow. Sarah, a practical woman, in her mid-20s, with honey-blonde hair tucked neatly under a simple bonnet, stopped short at the sight of the fort's most reclusive resident holding the baby. "Mr. Reed," she said, recovering quickly from her surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here." Mason acknowledged her with a slight nod, but made no move to relinquish Emma. "Mrs. Blackwood has agreed to help care for the child," Miller explained, "at least until more permanent arrangements can be made." "I have some experience with infants," Sarah said, stepping forward. "My sister had 3 little ones back in Pennsylvania." Mason reluctantly allowed Sarah to take Emma, who immediately began to fuss again at the transfer. "She seems to have taken a liking to you, Reed," Hamilton observed with a hint of amusement. Mason shrugged, his moment of unexpected connection already receding behind his customary reserve. "I should deliver my report, Colonel." "Yes, of course," Hamilton agreed. "Come to my office when you're ready." Mason turned to leave but paused at the door. "The passes to the north are already snowed in," he said. "The winter will be harsh this year." With that pronouncement he was gone, leaving the others to exchange puzzled glances. "I've never seen him take an interest in anything beyond his duties," Miller remarked. "Or speak more than 3 words at a time," Winters added. Sarah successfully quieted Emma and began to feed her the goat's milk, using a cloth dipped in the liquid. "Perhaps Mr. Reed has hidden depths," she suggested. Hamilton stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Everyone at Fort Callaway has secrets, Mrs. Blackwood. Some are just buried deeper than others." The news of Emma's arrival spread quickly through the fort. By midday, soldiers were volunteering portions of their pay to purchase supplies for the infant. Corporal Jackson, who had a talent for woodworking, offered to build a cradle. The quartermaster's wife produced a small collection of baby clothes, saved in hopes of a child of her own someday. Sarah Blackwood arranged temporary quarters for Emma in her and Private Jenkins' small room, but it quickly became apparent that the cramped space was inadequate for a couple and an infant. The baby's cries during the night left all three sleep-deprived and irritable. After 2 days of this arrangement, Colonel Hamilton called a meeting to discuss alternatives. Miller, Winters, Sarah, and a few other key personnel gathered in his office while Emma slept in an improvised basket nearby. "We need a more sustainable solution," Hamilton stated. "Mrs. Blackwood cannot be expected to sacrifice her privacy and rest indefinitely." "The supply room adjacent to the infirmary could be converted," Winters suggested. "It would allow multiple people to share the care of the child." "But who would take primary responsibility?" Miller asked. "Everyone has duties, and the child needs consistent care." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Mason Reed entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. His appearance at a meeting he hadn't been summoned to was unprecedented. "Reed," Hamilton acknowledged, unable to hide his surprise. "Did you need something?" Mason's eyes flicked to the sleeping Emma before addressing the colonel. "I'd like to care for the child, sir." The room fell into stunned silence. Of all the soldiers at Fort Callaway, Mason Reed was the last anyone would have expected to volunteer for such a responsibility. "You, Reed?" Miller finally asked. "No offense, but you barely speak to grown folk. What do you know about caring for an infant?" "I had 2 younger sisters," Mason replied simply. "Our mother died when the youngest was still nursing. It was more personal information than Mason had shared in his entire 3 years at the fort." "This isn't a temporary commitment," Winters cautioned. "We're looking at months of care before the weather allows safe travel." Mason nodded. "I understand." "And your scouting duties?" Hamilton inquired. "I can adjust my schedules for shorter excursions," Mason said, "and when longer missions are necessary, I'm sure Mrs. Blackwood or others would assist." He looked at Sarah questioningly. "Of course," she agreed, though she still appeared bewildered by the scout's unexpected offer. Hamilton studied Mason carefully. "May I ask why, Reed? This is unexpected." Mason was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "She has no one," he finally said, "and my cabin has the space." The simplicity of his answer somehow made further questioning feel intrusive. Hamilton looked around the room, seeking any objections. Finding none, he nodded. "Very well. We'll arrange for the necessary supplies to be delivered to your cabin. Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps you could instruct Reed on the basics of infant care." Sarah agreed, though she couldn't quite hide her skepticism. As the meeting concluded, Mason approached the basket where Emma slept. With gentle hands that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance, he lifted the sleeping infant. Emma stirred, but didn't wake, settling comfortably against his chest. "Reed," Hamilton called as Mason turned. "To leave, this is a significant responsibility you're undertaking." Mason looked down at the child in his arms, and for a brief moment something like peace crossed his usually guarded features. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I believe it is." None of them could have predicted then how this abandoned child would gradually break through the walls Mason Reed had built around himself, or how her presence would ultimately transform not just the solitary scout, but the entire community of Fort Callaway. The first night in Mason Reed's cabin revealed just how unprepared he was for the reality of caring for an infant. Emma woke every 2 hours, her cries piercing the quiet darkness. Mason paced the wooden floorboards, warming milk over the small stove, testing its temperature on his wrist as he'd seen Sarah Blackwood demonstrate. "You've got quite a set of lungs for someone so small," he murmured as Emma hungrily accepted the cloth-wrapped feeding method Sarah had devised. His cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, had transformed overnight. A makeshift cradle crafted by Corporal Jackson occupied the corner nearest the fireplace. Various baby supplies, cloth diapers, blankets, a spare set of baby clothes donated by the quartermaster's wife, were scattered across what had previously been an austere living space. By dawn, Mason's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but Emma finally slept peacefully. He studied her tiny features in the early morning light, filtering through the cabin's single window. Her small hands were curled into fists, and wisps of auburn hair framed her face. Something tightened in Mason's chest, an unfamiliar feeling. He couldn't quite name. A knock at the door startled him from his contemplation. Sarah Blackwood stood on his doorstep, a basket in hand. "I brought breakfast," she said, taking in his disheveled appearance with a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" Mason stepped aside to let her enter. "She's determined," he said simply. Sarah placed the basket on the table and moved to check on Emma. "That's a good sign. Strong will." She turned to Mason, who was eyeing the coffee she'd brought with undisguised longing. "Go on, have some. I'll watch her while you eat." Mason didn't need to be told twice. He poured a cup of the steaming liquid and took a grateful sip. "You know," Sarah ventured, "nobody would think less of you if you changed your mind. Taking care of a baby is demanding work." Mason's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not changing my mind." Sarah studied him curiously. "Most men would, especially men like you." "Men like me." Mason's voice held a rare edge. "Solitary men. Men who've arranged their lives to avoid attachments." Sarah wasn't intimidated by his tone. Her husband had warned her about Reed's standoffish nature, but she'd never been one to tiptoe around difficult subjects. "There's usually a reason for that." Mason turned away, his shoulders tense. "I gave my word," Sarah sighed. "Well, if you're determined to see this through, you'll need help. Not just with feedings and such, but with all of it." She gestured to the cabin. "Babies need more than food and shelter, Mr. Reed. They need touch, voices, faces. They need to be talked to, sang to." Mason looked genuinely alarmed at the mention of singing. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Don't worry. I'm not suggesting you need to burst into song. Just talk to her. Tell her stories. It doesn't matter what you say, only that she hears your voice." She hesitated, then added gently, "It might do you both some good." Before Mason could respond, Emma began to stir. Sarah demonstrated how to change the cloth diaper, narrating each step. Mason watched with intense concentration, as if memorizing battlefield tactics rather than baby care. "You're a quick study," Sarah noted as he successfully secured the fresh diaper. "Most men are hopeless with this part," Mason shrugged. "It's practical knowledge." "Indeed it is." Sarah gathered her things to leave. "I'll check in this evening. Send word if you need anything before then." After she departed, Mason found himself alone with Emma, who was now wide awake and staring at him with curious eyes. The silence in the cabin, once his greatest comfort, suddenly felt oppressive. "Right," he said uncertainly. "Sarah says I should talk to you." Emma blinked at him. "I'm not much for conversation," he admitted. "Haven't been for some time." Emma's small hand reached up, grasping at nothing in particular. Mason cautiously offered his finger, which she promptly gripped with surprising strength. "Strong," he noted approvingly. "You'll need that here. Winters aren't kind in this territory." And so began Mason's halting attempts at conversation. At first, he spoke in short, practical sentences about the weather or the day's tasks. Gradually, as days turned into weeks, his monologues expanded. He described the landscape beyond the fort's walls, the behavior of wildlife he tracked, the changing patterns of clouds that signaled weather shifts. Emma became his silent confidant, the only witness to the slow dismantling of his self-imposed isolation. October arrived with an unexpected warm spell, as if winter were drawing back for one final breath before its assault. Mason took advantage of the mild weather to establish a routine. Each morning, he strapped Emma to his chest in a carrier Sarah had fashioned from an old blanket and walked the perimeter of the fort, nodding acknowledgments to soldiers who no longer found the sight unusual. These walks served multiple purposes. Emma seemed calmed by the movement, often falling asleep against his chest. The fresh air and exercise helped Mason combat the exhaustion of nighttime feedings, and most surprisingly, the presence of the baby had begun to thaw the frigid social barriers between Mason and the rest of the fort's inhabitants. "She's filling out nicely," Dr. Winters commented during one of Emma's regular checkups. "You're doing well by her, Reed." Mason nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "She's resilient. As are you, it seems." Winters studied Mason with professional curiosity. "I don't believe I've heard you speak this many words in the entire 3 years you've been stationed here." Mason shifted Emma to his other arm, avoiding the doctor's gaze. "She needs to hear voices." "So Sarah Blackwood informed you," Winters said with a smile. "Wise woman, that one. And correct, of course. But I suspect the benefit isn't entirely one-sided." Mason made no reply, but he didn't immediately leave as he might have done in the past. "Colonel Hamilton mentioned you've requested a reduction in long-range scouting assignments," Winters continued, packing away his examination tools. "It's necessary," Mason said. "For now," Winters nodded thoughtfully. "For now, yes. Interesting. How, for now, has a way of stretching into something more permanent." Mason frowned slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning that connections change us, Reed. Even temporary ones." Winters closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. "Perhaps especially those we convince ourselves are temporary." Mason departed the infirmary. With Emma securely in his arms, the doctor's words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. He wasn't forming a connection with the child, couldn't afford to. Come spring, Emma would be sent to a proper family in a proper town, not kept at a remote military outpost by a man with blood on his hands. Yet as October gave way to November and the first heavy snows blanketed Fort Callaway, Mason found his carefully maintained boundaries continuing to erode. Emma achieved her first real smile one cold morning as Mason spoke to her while preparing breakfast. The sudden transformation of her face, the crinkling eyes, the wide, toothless grin, stopped him mid-sentence. "Well," he said after a stunned moment, "that's something." He found himself working to earn that smile again and again throughout the day. By evening, when Sarah stopped by with extra milk and to check on their progress, Mason had developed an entire repertoire of facial expressions and sounds specifically designed to delight the infant. "She smiled today," he informed Sarah without preamble as she entered. Sarah's eyebrows rose at his animated tone. "Did she now? That's wonderful." She observed Mason's proud expression with barely concealed amusement. "They do have a way of wrapping us around their tiny fingers, don't they?" Mason's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, as if he'd just realized how much of his guard had dropped. "It's a developmental milestone," he said more stiffly. "Winters mentioned it would happen around this time." Sarah shook her head, smiling. "It's all right to be pleased about it, Mr. Reed. No one will think less of your stoic reputation if you admit to being charmed by a baby's smile." Before Mason could formulate a response, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices and the sound of multiple horses approaching the fort at speed. "Stay here," Mason instructed, handing Emma to Sarah. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door and stepped outside. A patrol had returned earlier than expected, their horses lathered despite the cold. Sergeant Miller was helping a wounded private down from his mount, the man's uniform stained dark with blood. "What happened?" Colonel Hamilton demanded, emerging from his quarters. "Ambush at Eagle Creek," Miller reported grimly. "Jackson took a bullet in the shoulder. Michaels didn't make it." Mason approached as Dr. Winters rushed forward to examine the wounded man. "Who ambushed you?" Miller glanced up, surprise flickering across his features at Reed's voluntary involvement in the situation. "Deserters, we think. Group of 5 or 6 men, well armed. They scattered after the initial attack." "Deserters?" Hamilton frowned. "From which unit?" "Couldn't tell, sir. They weren't in uniform." Hamilton turned to Mason. "Reed, I know you've reduced your scouting duties, but we need to track these men before the next snow covers their trail." Mason hesitated, his thoughts, turning to Emma, waiting in his cabin with Sarah. "How far did the patrol pursue them?" "About 2 miles northeast before Michaels was hit," Miller replied. "They were heading toward the Blackwater Ridge." Mason nodded. "I know that area. If they're seeking shelter, there are only 3 or 4 viable locations this time of year." "Can you lead a party to investigate?" Hamilton asked. "We can't have armed hostiles operating this close to the fort." Mason weighed his responsibilities. A scout's duty was clear, but he had made promises regarding Emma. "I'll need to make arrangements," he said finally. "Mrs. Blackwood has already volunteered to care for the child during your absence," Hamilton said, his tone gentler than usual. "She anticipated your concern." Of course she had. Mason nodded his acceptance. "I'll need 4 men. We'll leave at first light." As preparations for the expedition were made, Mason returned to his cabin to gather his tracking gear and spend a few final hours with Emma. Sarah had settled the baby in her cradle and was darning socks by the fire. "How long will you be gone?" she asked as Mason entered. 2 days, 3 at most, depending on the weather and the trail. Mason moved to check on Emma, who was sleeping soundly. "You'll stay here in the cabin?" Sarah nodded. "It's easier than moving all her things. Jenkins will help me carry water and firewood." Mason knelt beside the cradle, studying Emma's peaceful face. "Tell her," he began, then stopped, unsure what he actually wanted to say. "I'll tell her you'll be back soon," Sarah supplied softly. "She may be young, but she knows who cares for her, Mr. Reed. Babies are perceptive that way." "Mason," he said abruptly, "if you're going to be living in my cabin and caring for—" He gestured vaguely toward the cradle. "Mason is fine," Sarah smiled. "Very well, Mason. We'll manage until you return." Dawn brought clear skies and bitter cold as Mason led a small party from the fort. The trail was still visible in the thin layer of fresh snow, heading northeast toward the rugged hills that locals called Blackwater Ridge. Mason rode slightly ahead of the others, his senses fully engaged in the tracking process, grateful for the familiar rhythm of the work. Yet his thoughts kept straying back to the fort, to the small cabin where Emma was probably awake now, being fed her morning milk by Sarah. He wondered if she would notice his absence, if she would remember him. When he returned, "You're distracted, Reed," Miller observed, as they stopped to water the horses at a half-frozen stream. "Not like you." Mason tightened his mount's saddle straps. "I'm focused on the trail," Miller snorted. "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England." He lowered his voice so the other men couldn't hear. "It's natural to worry about her, but Sarah Blackwood's capable, and the whole fort would step in if needed." Mason looked up sharply. "I'm not worried." "Course not." Miller's mustache twitched, with poorly concealed amusement. "It's just that a man gets used to certain responsibilities, hard to set them aside, even temporarily." Before Mason could respond, one of the privates called out, pointing to fresh tracks diverging from the main trail they'd been following. "They've split up," Mason observed, examining the snow. 2 riders continued east, the others turned north, toward the caves. Miller frowned. "Why would they separate?" "Strategy," Mason replied. "If pursued, they increase their chances of escape." He studied the landscape, making calculations. "The northern group is our primary concern. The caves provide shelter and a defensive position. If they're planning anything against the fort, that's where they'd establish a base." "We should split up too, then," Miller suggested. "Cover both trails." Mason shook his head. "Too risky with unknown hostiles. We follow the northern track together." He mounted his horse. "If these are indeed deserters, they're trained soldiers. We maintain group strength." The trail led them into increasingly difficult terrain. By midday they were forced to dismount and lead their horses up a narrow rocky path that wound between towering pines laden with snow. Mason moved with the quiet efficiency that had made him the fort's most valued scout, reading subtle signs in the disturbed snow and broken twigs that were invisible to less experienced eyes. As they approached a ridgeline overlooking a series of small caves carved into the hillside, Mason signaled for the party to halt. He handed his reins to Miller and crawled forward on his stomach to survey the area below. Smoke rose from the largest cave entrance, a thin, barely visible wisp that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. 2 horses were tethered in a sheltered alcove, partially hidden by pine boughs deliberately arranged for concealment. Mason retreated to report his findings. 2 men, possibly more inside. They've established a camp in the main cave. "Armed?" Miller asked. "Assume so," Mason replied. "The approach is exposed. They'll see us coming if we go in directly." Miller contemplated this. "Night assault." Mason shook his head. "Weather's turning. We need to resolve this before the storm hits." He pointed to a narrow, winding path that circled around the western side of the ridge. "There's a smaller entrance to that cave system, from above. It's tight but passable. 1 man could come in from behind while the rest create a diversion from the front." "You know these caves well," Miller observed. A shadow crossed Mason's face. "I've used them for shelter in the past." The plan was quickly established. Mason would navigate the upper entrance, while Miller and the 3 privates created a distraction. At the main cave mouth, simple, direct, minimizing risk to the soldiers, while maximizing the chance of capturing the deserters for questioning. As Mason worked his way along the treacherous path to the upper cave entrance, snow began to fall, lightly. At first, then with increasing intensity. The approaching storm would complicate their return to the fort. He needed to complete this mission efficiently. The upper entrance was just as he remembered it, a narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He removed his heavy coat to reduce his bulk and eased into the dark opening. The passage descended steeply, requiring him to brace against both walls to control his descent. The air grew warmer as he progressed, carrying the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Voices echoed up from below, 2 men arguing in low, tense tones. Mason couldn't make out all the words, but the tone suggested disagreement about their next move. He continued his careful descent until a faint light appeared ahead, emanating from the main cave. Mason drew his revolver and paused, waiting for Miller's diversion. Moments later, a commanding shout echoed through the cave. "This is the United States Army. Come out with your hands raised." The voices below fell silent, followed by the scraping of boots on stone and the metallic click of weapons being readied. Mason moved swiftly now, emerging into a small chamber connected to the main cave. 2 men had taken positions behind rock formations, rifles aimed at the main entrance. "Drop your weapons," Mason ordered, his revolver trained on the nearest man. Both deserters whirled in shock, clearly not expecting an attack from behind. The nearest man, young, bearded, with wild eyes, swung his rifle toward Mason. Mason fired first, the report deafeningly loud in the confined space. The man crumpled, his unfired weapon clattering to the stone floor. The second deserter immediately threw down his rifle, raising his hands. "Don't shoot! I surrender!" Miller and 2 privates rushed in from the main entrance, quickly securing. The surviving deserter, the 3rd private, remained outside with the horses. "Anyone else in here?" Miller demanded. The captured deserter shook his head. "Just us 2. The others went east." Mason knelt beside the man he'd shot, checking for signs of life. The bullet had struck him in the chest. Death had been almost instantaneous. As Mason rolled him over to search for identification, his hand went instinctively to the man's shirt pocket. Inside was a folded paper, similar to the note found with Emma. Mason opened it, his blood running cold as he read the hastily scrawled message. "If this reaches Fort Calloway, the child is in danger. They're coming for her. Trust no one." Mason stared at the note, his mind racing to make connections. His fingers tightened around the paper, crinkling its edges. "What is it?" Miller asked, noticing Mason's sudden tension. Mason hesitated, then passed him the note. As Miller read it, his expression darkened. "What child? What does this mean?" Miller demanded of their prisoner. The captured deserter shrugged, genuine confusion on his face. "I don't know anything about no child. We just found a dead rider yesterday, took his supplies. That paper was in his pocket." Mason and Miller exchanged glances. "The other riders who headed east, did they mention a fort?" Mason pressed. "They didn't tell us much," the deserter admitted. "Burke and Reynolds, they were in charge, said we'd meet them at Cottonwood Creek in 2 days. "Burke and Reynolds," Miller repeated. "Those names mean anything to you, Reed?" Mason shook his head. "But the timing is suspect. Emma was left at the fort just over a month ago. Now this warning appears." The deserter looked between them, realization dawning. "Wait, you've got a baby at the fort. What is this about?" Mason didn't reply, already moving toward the cave entrance. "We need to get back, now." "The storm's picking up," one of the privates warned. "Visibility's poor." "Then we move fast," Mason said, his voice hard with determination. "Miller, secure the prisoner. We leave immediately." The return journey was grueling. What had been a light snowfall when they entered the caves had transformed into a raging blizzard. Wind howled across the ridge, driving snow into their faces and reducing visibility to mere yards. Their prisoner, hands bound and tethered to Miller's saddle, struggled to keep pace as they descended toward flatter ground. Mason led the way, his instincts for navigation proving invaluable as landmarks disappeared under the white onslaught. His thoughts remained fixed on Emma and the cryptic warning. Who would want to harm an infant? What possible danger could she represent? The answers, he suspected, lay with her parents. The note left with Emma mentioned her father dying at Powder River, but gave no names, no details that might identify the family. Mason had assumed it was a simple case of a widowed mother unable to care for her child alone, a sadly common story in these territories. Now he wasn't so sure. "Reed!" Miller called over the wind. "We need shelter. Men are freezing." Mason reluctantly acknowledged the truth of it. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the nearest shelter, an abandoned trapper's cabin, was still hours away at their current pace. The fort remained a full day's ride in good conditions. "There's a ravine 1/2 mile ahead," he shouted. "Back. We can make camp in the lee of the eastern wall, some protection from the wind." It was a grim encampment they established as darkness fell. A meager fire struggled against the elements, providing more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The men huddled close, rotating positions to ensure everyone had some time near the flames. Their prisoner sat apart, watched carefully by one of the privates. Mason stood at the edge of their small circle of light, staring into the storm-swept darkness, as if by sheer will he could see through the miles separating him from the fort, from Emma. Miller joined him, offering a tin cup of coffee. "We'll reach the fort tomorrow," he said. "Emma's safe with Sarah." Mason accepted the coffee without comment. "You think this is connected to her somehow?" Miller pressed. "The ambush, the warning." "Too many coincidences." Mason took a sip of the bitter liquid. The timing of her arrival, this note appearing just weeks later. But who would target an infant? It makes no sense. Mason's jaw tightened. "Unless she's not who we think she is." "Meaning what exactly?" I don't know yet. Mason turned to look at their prisoner. But I intend to find out. He approached the deserter, who eyed him warily. The man was younger than Mason had initially thought, barely 20, with hollow cheeks and the haunted look of someone who had seen too much violence too young. "The rider you found," Mason began without preamble. "Describe him." The deserter shifted uncomfortably. Middle-aged fella, civilian clothes, but sat a horse like military, had a nasty wound in his side, looked days old, gone bad. Did he have any identification? Letters, papers besides the note? Burke took anything valuable. I just saw the body when they dragged it off trail. And where was this? East side of Clearwater Valley, maybe 15 miles from here. Mason processed this information, plotting the location mentally. If the rider had been heading toward Fort Callaway from the east, he might have come from Fort Laramie, or even further, possibly St. Louis. The men who went east, Burke and Reynolds, did they mention their plans beyond meeting at Cottonwood? "Greek," the deserter hesitated. "Your cooperation now determines how you're treated later," Miller interjected. "They talked about a payoff," the deserter finally admitted. "Big money for some kind of job. Reynolds kept saying it was their ticket out of the territory." "What kind of job?" Mason pressed. "Didn't say exactly. Just that it was at a fort, and timing was crucial." Mason and Miller exchanged grim looks. The implications were clear enough. "Get some rest," Mason told Miller. "I'll take first watch." Sleep evaded Mason despite his exhaustion. His mind churned with fragments of information, trying to form a coherent picture. Emma's arrival, the deserters, the warning. Somewhere in this tangle of events was a truth that put an innocent child at risk, a child who had somehow become vitally important to him. The storm began to abate near dawn, the howling wind diminishing to occasional gusts. Mason roused the men early, eager to cover as much distance as possible while daylight lasted. They broke camp quickly, their movements efficient despite cold-stiffened muscles and minimal rest. The landscape had been transformed overnight. Drifts of snow smoothed the rugged terrain into gentle contours, deceptively serene. Mason led them along ridgelines where the wind had swept the ground relatively clear, making travel easier for their tired horses. By mid-afternoon, familiar landmarks appeared through brief gaps in the clouds. They pushed harder, knowing the fort lay just beyond the next ridge. Mason felt tension coiling tighter in his chest with each mile. The rational part of his mind insisted Emma was safe, protected by the fort's walls and Sarah's care. Yet the warning haunted him. They're coming for her. Fort Callaway came into view as they crested the final rise. The sight of the sturdy wooden walls and the smoke rising from chimneys within should have brought relief. Instead, Mason felt his unease intensify as he noted an unusual number of men patrolling the ramparts. "Something's happened," Miller said, echoing Mason's thoughts. They spurred their mounts forward, covering the remaining distance at a gallop. The gate swung open at their approach, and Colonel Hamilton himself waited to receive them, his expression grave. "Colonel," Miller saluted. "We captured one deserter, neutralized another." Hamilton nodded curtly. "Inside, gentlemen. We have a situation." Mason dismounted, handing his reins to a waiting private. "Emma?" "Safe," Hamilton assured him. "But there've been developments." The colonel led them to his office, where Dr. Winters and Lieutenant Parker were waiting. The tension in the room was palpable. "3 strangers approached the fort this morning," Hamilton began without preamble. "They claimed to be traders seeking shelter from the storm." Parker was suspicious. Their story had inconsistencies. "They were armed more heavily than typical traders," Parker added, "and they asked specific questions about recent arrivals at the fort." Mason's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Emma?" Hamilton nodded. "When pressed, they became evasive. We denied them entry and assigned extra guards to the walls. They withdrew, but have made camp just beyond rifle range. They're watching the fort." "We found this on a dead rider," Miller said, producing the warning note. He explained the circumstances of its discovery as Hamilton read it. "This confirms my suspicions," Hamilton said grimly. "These men aren't traders. They're here for the child." "But why?" Winters asked, bewildered. "What possible threat could an infant pose? Perhaps it's not the child herself, but who she is," Hamilton suggested. "Or who her parents were." Mason had remained silent, processing the information. Now he spoke. "I need to see Emma." Hamilton nodded. "Of course. She's with Sarah in your cabin under guard." "Reed," he called as Mason turned to leave. "We need to know what we're dealing with here. These men are willing to risk a confrontation with the United States Army. This isn't a simple matter." "I understand," Mason said, his voice tight. "But first, I need to see for myself that she's safe." The sight of Emma, peacefully sleeping in her cradle while Sarah darned socks nearby, loosened something in Mason's chest. A private stood guard outside the cabin door, nodding respectfully as Mason approached. "Any disturbances?" Mason asked. "No, sir. All quiet." Inside, Sarah looked up with relief. "You're back. We heard about the strangers at the gate." Mason moved immediately to the cradle, studying Emma's face as if searching for changes in his absence. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, her breathing deep and even. She'd grown in the short time he'd known her features more defined, her auburn hair thicker. "She missed you," Sarah said softly. "Was fussier than usual last night." Mason gently touched Emma's small hand with his finger. Her tiny fingers curled reflexively around it, even in sleep. That unfamiliar tightness returned to his chest. "I found something," he told Sarah, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Emma. He showed her the warning note. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. "What does it mean? Who would want to harm a baby?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Mason carefully extracted his finger from Emma's grip. "Stay with her. Don't open the door for anyone but me, Miller, or the Colonel. Where are you going? To get answers?" Mason returned to Hamilton's office, where a strategy session was underway. Maps of the surrounding territory were spread across the desk, marked with the positions of the strangers' camp and possible reinforcement routes. "They're waiting for something," Parker was saying. "Or someone." "The other deserters," Mason interjected. "Two more headed east when we intercepted the pair at the caves. They mentioned meeting at Cottonwood Creek." Hamilton located the creek on the map. "That's a day's ride from here. If they're planning to rendezvous with these traders, we have limited time." "We should arrest these men now," Parker argued. "They're clearly hostile." "On what charge?" Hamilton countered. "They haven't broken any laws yet, and a confrontation might trigger whatever they're planning." "We need information," Mason said. "About Emma, about why anyone would consider her a target." Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. "The note left with her mentioned her father dying at Powder River. That's our only lead." "The battle was 6 months ago," Miller noted. "Records would be at Fort Laramie or back east by now." "Not all records," Dr. Winters interjected. "I treated the wounded from that engagement when they were brought here afterward. I kept my own medical logs." Hope flickered in Mason's chest. "Could you identify casualties by name, particularly officers?" "Possibly. Give me an hour to review my notes." While Winters searched his records, Mason returned to his cabin. Sarah had finished her darning and was preparing a simple meal at the small stove. Emma was awake now, lying on a blanket on the floor, studying her own hands with fascination. "Any news?" Sarah asked. Mason shook his head, kneeling beside Emma. When she noticed him, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her features. Despite the gravity of the situation, Mason felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward in response. "She definitely recognizes you now," Sarah observed. "Started watching the door whenever she heard footsteps outside." Something shifted in Mason's perspective at those words. Emma wasn't just a responsibility he'd accepted out of duty. She had formed an attachment to him, trusted him. The realization was both warming and terrifying. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah answered cautiously, then admitted Dr. Winters, who clutched a leather-bound journal. "I found something," Winters announced, his expression troubled. "From the Powder River engagement." Mason rose to his feet. "What is it?" "Among the casualties was Captain James Wilson, intelligence officer. He was brought here with a severe abdominal wound. Died 3 days later." Winters opened his journal to a marked page. Before he died, he was delirious, talking about documents he'd secured, evidence of corruption involving military contracts and certain officials in Washington. "What kind of corruption?" Sarah asked. "Supply contracts, primarily. Millions of dollars diverted through shell companies. Wilson had apparently been investigating for months, said he'd gathered proof, names, bank records, correspondence." Mason frowned. "What does this have to do with Emma?" "That's just it." Winters continued. "In his final hours, Wilson kept mentioning his daughter. Said she was the key because her mother had hidden something with her, something the conspirators would kill to recover." A chill ran through Mason. Emma could be Wilson's daughter. "The timing fits," Winters confirmed. "If Wilson was killed 6 months ago and Emma is approximately 4 months old now. A posthumous child," Sarah whispered. "Just as we suspected." Mason's mind raced through the implications. The mother must have realized she was in danger. She hid whatever evidence Wilson had gathered, then brought Emma here, hoping she'd be safe within the fort's walls. But if these men work for the conspirators Wilson was investigating, Winters said grimly, they'll stop at nothing to find what was hidden. And they believe it's somehow with Emma, Mason concluded, looking at the infant who was now contentedly grasping at her own feet, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding her. Sarah moved closer to Emma, as if to shield her. What could and possibly be hidden with a baby? Mason knelt again, studying Emma more carefully now. Her simple dress, the blanket she'd been wrapped in when found, the small wooden rattle someone at the fort had carved for her, none seemed likely hiding places for sensitive documents. When Emma was left at the gate, he asked slowly, was anything else found with her besides the note? Just the quilt she was wrapped in, Sarah replied. I've been using it in her cradle. Mason moved to the cradle, lifting the patchwork quilt. That lined the bottom. It was faded but well made, with dozens of squares in various patterns. I've washed it twice since she arrived, Sarah added. Nothing unusual about it. Mason ran his fingers over the fabric, feeling each square, each seam. Then he paused, his fingers detecting something unusual in the border, a slight stiffness that differed from the rest of the quilt. "Scissors," he requested tersely. Sarah brought him a small pair from her sewing basket. Mason carefully cut along one seam of the border, then reached inside. His fingers touched something that crinkled. Paper, thin and tightly folded. He withdrew. A small packet, no larger than his palm, wrapped in oilcloth for protection. Inside were several sheets of paper covered in tiny, precise handwriting, along with what appeared to be banking documents. Wilson's evidence, Winters breathed. Mason scanned the pages quickly, his expression hardening as he read. Names, dates, amounts, instructions for hiding funds through a network of banks. He looked up grimly. Some very powerful people are implicated here, including 2 generals and a deputy secretary of war, Winters noted, reading over Mason's shoulder. Mason carefully rewrapped the documents. This is why they want Emma, not for who she is, but for what was hidden with her. What do we do now? Sarah asked, gathering Emma protectively in her arms. Mason's jaw set with determination. We protect her, and we expose the truth. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the pounding of boots on packed snow. Mason moved to the window, peering cautiously outside. A rider had arrived at the fort. A civilian. His horse lathered despite the cold. Soldiers surrounded him as he dismounted, clearly agitated. "Stay here," Mason instructed, handing the document packet to Winters. "Guard these with your life." He stepped outside, one hand resting on his revolver as he approached the gathering crowd. Colonel Hamilton was already questioning the newcomer, who spoke in rapid, urgent tones. At least 20 men, heavily armed. They crossed Cottonwood. "Creek at dawn, heading this way." Mason caught Hamilton's eye. The colonel nodded grimly, confirming his presence was needed. As Mason joined them, the stranger turned, and Mason found himself staring into familiar eyes. "You!" the man gasped, recognition flashing across his features. From Ash Creek. Mason froze, memories crashing over him like an icy wave. This was no stranger. This was Robert Wilson, Captain James Wilson's brother, one of the few survivors of the Ash Creek ambush that had haunted Mason for 3 years. "Reed," Wilson said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You're the last person I expected to find here." "You know each other?" Hamilton asked, glancing between them. "We've met," Mason replied tightly. Wilson's laugh held no humor. "That's one way to—" He put it. "He led my brother and 16 other men into an ambush at Ash Creek. Only 4 of us walked out alive." Hamilton frowned. "Reed was cleared of any negligence in that incident. So the official report says." Wilson's gaze never left Mason's face. "Convenient that the man who provided the faulty intelligence disappeared immediately afterward." Mason's hand tightened on his revolver. "Why are you here, Wilson?" "I came to warn the fort. Men are coming, dangerous men working for powerful people." Wilson's expression shifted from hostility to confusion. "But how are you involved in this? Unless—" His eyes widened with sudden understanding. "You have her, don't you? James's and daughter, Emma." The confirmation that Emma was indeed Captain Wilson's child landed with weight. Mason exchanged glances with Hamilton, a silent communication passing between them. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private," Hamilton suggested, gesturing toward his office. As they moved away from the curious onlookers, Mason felt a growing certainty that the coming confrontation would force him to face not only the immediate threat to Emma, but also the ghosts of his past that he'd spent 3 years trying to outrun. Hamilton's office felt too small for the storm of emotions brewing within it. Mason stood by the window, deliberately positioning himself to keep both the colonel and Robert Wilson in his sight, while maintaining a clear view of the path to his cabin. "Start from the beginning," Hamilton instructed Wilson. "Leave nothing out." Wilson removed his snow-crusted hat, revealing hair the same auburn shade as Emma's. The family resemblance was unmistakable now that Mason knew to look for it. "My brother James was assigned to investigate supply discrepancies along the western frontier," Wilson began. "What started as a routine audit spiraled into something much larger. He uncovered a network of corruption reaching all the way to Washington. Military contracts being awarded to companies owned by shell corporations, supplies paid for but never delivered. Millions of dollars siphoned from Army coffers." "And he gathered evidence," Hamilton prompted. Wilson nodded. "Ledgers, correspondence, banking records, enough to implicate over a dozen high-ranking officials. But before he could report to his superiors, he realized some of them were involved. He didn't know who to trust. So he kept his investigation secret," Mason surmised, "until Powder River." Wilson's expression darkened. He was shot during the engagement, not by enemy fire but from behind, by one of our own. The official report listed it as a tragic accident in the chaos of battle. Hamilton frowned. "You're alleging a deliberate assassination by U.S. Army personnel?" "I'm stating it as fact, Colonel. James wrote to me before he died, warning me that his life was in danger. When I received word of his passing, I traveled to Fort Laramie, hoping to recover his personal effects and any evidence he might have." Secured, but they were already gone, Mason guessed. Wilson's eyes narrowed at Mason's insight. Precisely. His quarters had been thoroughly searched. Someone knew what he'd discovered and was desperate to recover it. What about his wife, Emma's mother? Hamilton asked. Elizabeth. A flash of grief crossed Wilson's features. James had sent her east when he first suspected danger. She was staying with friends in St. Louis when Emma was born. When James died, she realized they would come for her next. So she hid the evidence and brought Emma here, Mason concluded, hoping the child would be safe within a military installation while she led any pursuers away from her daughter. Wilson nodded grimly. Elizabeth reached me 2 weeks ago. She was exhausted, terrified. She explained that she'd sewn James's documents into Emma's quilt before leaving her at Fort Callaway. She chose this fort specifically because it was remote, staffed mostly by career soldiers with impeccable records. His gaze hardened as it fell on Mason. Though clearly her information was incomplete, Mason ignored the barb. Where is Elizabeth? Now. Wilson's expression told the story before his words could. Dead. We were ambushed 3 days ago near Clearwater Valley. Elizabeth was killed instantly. I was wounded, but managed to escape. I've been riding ever since, trying to reach the fort before Burke's men. Burke? Mason and Hamilton exchanged sharp glances. Elias Burke. Former army captain, now works as an enforcer for whoever's paying. He's leading the men coming this way. We encountered some of his group yesterday, Mason informed him. 2 were neutralized, but Burke and the others continued east. To meet with the advance party already watching the fort, Hamilton concluded. The traders who arrived this morning. How? Many men does Burke command? Mason asked. At least 20 that I've seen. Well armed, well trained, many are former military. Hamilton moved to his desk, unrolling a map of the fort and surrounding terrain. We have 42 soldiers currently stationed here, plus the scout. Team that returned with Reed, not ideal odds against determined attackers. They won't attack openly, Wilson warned. Not at first. Burke prefers infiltration, creating chaos from within. The traders were likely assessing your defenses, looking for vulnerabilities. Mason's thoughts went immediately to Emma, alone, with Sarah and Winters in his cabin. We need to secure the evidence and move Emma to a safer location within the fort. The armory, Hamilton suggested. Solid stone construction, single entrance easily defended. A commotion outside interrupted. Their planning. Raised voices, then urgent footsteps approaching the office door. Lieutenant Parker burst in without knocking, his expression tense. Colonel, riders approaching from the east, a dozen at least. Burke, Wilson confirmed grimly. Hamilton straightened, years of command experience evident in his decisive tone. Parker, sound general quarters, all men to battle stations. Double the guard at every entrance. No one enters or leaves the fort without my direct authorization. Yes, sir. Parker saluted and hurried out. Reed, Hamilton continued, secure the child and the documents. Take them to the armory as discussed. Mason nodded and moved toward the door. I'm coming with you, Wilson declared, rising from his chair. Mason paused, studying the man who clearly blamed him for his brother's death at Ash Creek. As you wish. The 2 men exited into the growing commotion of a fort, preparing for a potential siege. Soldiers hurried to their posts, checking weapons, distributing ammunition. The evening sky had cleared after the storm. A cold crescent moon, casting silver light on the snow-covered grounds. Mason set a brisk pace toward his cabin, Wilson matching his stride despite his evident exhaustion from days of hard riding. What really happened at Ash Creek? Wilson asked abruptly, his voice low enough that only Mason could hear. The official report claimed faulty intelligence, but James never believed it. Mason's jaw tightened. For 3 years, he'd avoided discussing Ash Creek with anyone, The memories were too raw, the guilt too overwhelming. "This isn't the time," he responded tersely. "If I'm trusting you with my niece's life, I deserve answers." Mason stopped, turning to face Wilson. "Your brother was right to be suspicious. The intelligence wasn't just faulty, it was deliberately falsified. I was given maps showing clear routes where there were deadly choke points, enemy positions marked miles from where they actually were." Wilson's expression hardened. "By whom?" "Major Lawrence Caldwell. He personally briefed me before I led the patrol." "Caldwell?" Wilson looked genuinely surprised. "His name was in James's documents, one of the principal conspirators in the contract." "Scheme." Mason nodded grimly. "After Ash Creek, I began to question the intelligence I'd been given. Caldwell arranged for my immediate transfer before I could investigate further. By the time I realized what had happened, the official inquiry had already absolved me of responsibility and closed the matter." Understanding dawned in Wilson's eyes. Ash Creek wasn't a random tragedy. It was the elimination of witnesses, soldiers, who might have observed something connected to the corruption James was investigating. "I've spent 3 years trying to forget those men's faces," Mason admitted, the admission painful after so long. "Trying to convince myself I wasn't responsible for leading them to their deaths. And now Caldwell's conspirators are coming for Emma," Wilson said grimly. The weight of this connection settled between them, a shared burden of truth long buried. Without further words, they resumed their pace toward Mason's cabin. Inside, they found Sarah holding Emma, while Dr. Winters carefully examined the documents they'd recovered from the quilt. Both looked up in alarm as Mason and Wilson entered. "The fort's preparing for a possible attack," Mason explained quickly. "We need to move to the armory." Sarah immediately began gathering Emma's essentials: milk, diapers, a spare blanket. Winters carefully refolded the documents into their oilcloth wrapping. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, eyeing Wilson cautiously. "Robert Wilson, Emma's uncle," Mason replied. "James Wilson's brother." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. She looked down at Emma, then back at Wilson, noting the unmistakable family resemblance. "She has your coloring." A complex emotion crossed Wilson's face as he approached and truly saw his niece for the first time. Emma, now awake and alert, studied the newcomer with curious eyes. "Elizabeth's nose," he murmured, "but James's eyes, definitely." He reached out hesitantly, and Emma grasped his finger with her characteristic strength. "She's perfect." The moment of connection was brief, but powerful. Mason watched something shift in Wilson's posture, a renewed determination, a strengthening of purpose. "We need to move," Mason reminded them, gathering his rifle and extra ammunition. "Stay close, stay quiet." They exited the cabin into the tense atmosphere of a fort, preparing for conflict. Mason led them along the eastern wall, keeping to shadows where possible. The armory stood near the center of the fort, a squat stone building originally constructed as a powder magazine. Its thick walls and iron-bound door made it the most defensible structure within Fort Calloway. As they approached, a sharp crack shattered the evening calm. A rifle shot from the direction of the main gate. Shouts followed, then more gunfire. "They're making their move," Wilson said tersely. Mason quickened their pace. "Inside, quickly!" The armory door swung open at their approach, Sergeant Miller waiting to usher them in. Several oil lamps illuminated the interior, casting long shadows across. Racks of rifles and ammunition crates. Miller secured the door behind them, dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. "Colonel's compliments," Miller informed them. "You're to remain here until the situation is resolved." He nodded toward a corner where blankets had been arranged on a cot. "Figured the little one might need somewhere comfortable." Sarah settled on the cot with Emma, who was becoming fussy, disturbed by the tension and unfamiliar surroundings. Wilson joined Winters at a small table where the doctor was studying the documents more thoroughly. Mason moved to the narrow window, peering. out at the chaotic scene unfolding across the fort grounds. "What's happening?" he asked Miller. "Burke's men tried rushing the main gate under cover of their first shots," Miller reported. "Parker was ready for them. Drove them back with minimal casualties on our side. They've withdrawn beyond rifle range. For now, but they're not leaving." "They won't," Wilson confirmed from across the room. "Not without these documents and the child." "Why take Emma at all?" Sarah asked, gently bouncing the increasingly agitated infant. "If all they want is the evidence." Wilson's expression darkened. "Insurance, leverage. These men aren't known for their mercy, especially toward witnesses." Emma's fussing increased, her face scrunching up as she worked herself toward a full cry. Sarah tried to soothe her, but the baby seemed inconsolable. "She senses the danger," Winters observed. Mason hesitated, then moved to Sarah's side. "May I?" Sarah willingly transferred Emma to Mason's arms. The effect was immediate. Emma's cries diminished as she recognized the familiar presence. She hiccuped several times, then settled against his chest, one tiny hand grasping the fabric of his shirt. Wilson watched this interaction with evident surprise. "She knows you. Reed's been caring for her since she arrived," Miller explained. "Turned his whole life upside down for this little one." Mason met Wilson's questioning gaze without apology. "She needed someone. I was available." Before Wilson could respond, another volley of gunfire erupted outside, closer this time. Mason returned to the window, Emma still secure in his arms. What he saw sent a chill through him. "They've breached the western wall," he reported tersely. 4, maybe 5 men inside the perimeter. Miller immediately checked his rifle. "I should report to the colonel." "Wait." Mason's sharp tones stopped Miller at the door. "Something's not right. The main attack at the gate, now a small breach at the western wall, it's too uncoordinated for Burke." Wilson joined him at the window. "Unless the gate assault was a diversion, what's near the western breach?" "Supply buildings, stables, enlisted, men's quarters," Miller listed. Mason's expression hardened with sudden understanding. "And the infirmary, where Burke would expect us to take an infant for safety." Wilson nodded grimly. "The gate attack draws your forces forward. The western breach allows a small team to infiltrate and search specific targets." "But we're not at the infirmary," Miller pointed out. "No," Mason agreed. "But how long before they expand their search? We can't risk being cornered here." "The armory is the most defensible position," Miller argued. "It's also a dead end," Mason countered. "One door, minimal windows. If they overrun the fort, we're trapped." "What do you suggest?" Wilson asked. Mason studied Emma's face for a long moment, her eyes now heavy with approaching sleep despite the chaos. His decision crystallized. "With absolute clarity, we need to get Emma and the documents away from the fort altogether," he stated. "If Burke captures Fort Callaway, nowhere inside these walls will remain safe." "Leave the fort?" Sarah looked alarmed. "In the middle of an attack with an infant?" "It's our best chance," Mason insisted. "I know these territories better than anyone. Certainly better than Burke's men. We can reach the Blackwater mission station by dawn if we leave now." "Through a blizzard with armed men hunting us," Winters objected. "The storm has passed," Mason replied, "and they'll focus their search here, within the fort, at least initially. By the time they realize we've fled, we'll have a significant head start." Miller considered the plan, clearly torn between his duty to remain at his post and the logic of Mason's argument. "The colonel ordered you to stay here." "The colonel expected the fort to withstand attack," Mason pointed out. "The situation has changed." Wilson had been silent, weighing the options. Now he spoke. "Reed is right. Emma's safety takes priority over everything. The mission station has telegraph capabilities." Mason nodded. "Direct line to Fort Laramie. From there we can get these documents to trustworthy authorities." "I'll accompany you," Wilson decided. "As will I," Winters added. The child may need medical attention during the journey. Mason turned to Miller. We'll need supplies, horses. Can you arrange it without drawing attention? Miller hesitated only briefly before nodding. The east stables were emptied to consolidate. Defenses. I can have 3 horses waiting in 20 minutes. Basic supplies as well. We leave from the postern gate, Mason instructed. It's small, rarely used, less likely to be watched. As Miller departed to make preparations, Sarah approached Mason. I should come too. Emma knows me. Mason shook his head gently. She'll be safer with fewer people. A larger group leaves a more visible trail. Sarah clearly wanted to argue, but recognized the logic. Instead, she helped gather Emma's necessities into a small bundle that could be easily carried. Wilson retrieved the documents from the table where Winters had been examining them. These names, they include 2 generals, a deputy secretary of war, 3 congressmen, and over a dozen contractors. If we can get this evidence to the right authorities, the entire network will collapse. And if we fail, they'll continue stealing from the government and eliminating anyone who discovers their operation, Winters added grimly. Mason looked down at Emma, now sleeping peacefully despite the sporadic gunfire outside. We won't fail. 20 minutes later, they stood at the small postern gate in the eastern wall. The narrow passage, primarily used for disposing of waste and accessing the nearby stream, was barely wide enough for a horse to pass through. Miller had delivered on his promise. 3 horses waited saddled and loaded with essential supplies. The fighting's concentrated at the main gate and western breach, Miller reported in a hushed tone. This area appears clear for now. Mason carefully transferred the sleeping Emma to a sling Sarah had created, which allowed him to carry the infant securely against his chest while leaving his hands free. Winters and Wilson mounted their horses, both men tense but determined. What? Should I tell the colonel? Miller asked. The truth, Mason replied. That we've gone to protect Emma and secure the evidence. That we're heading for the mission to summon reinforcements from Fort Laramie. Miller nodded, then hesitated. Reed. Good luck. Mason acknowledged this rare expression of camaraderie. With a slight nod before mounting his horse, Emma stirred but didn't wake, nestled warmly against him. Miller eased the postern gate open just wide enough for the horses to pass through single file. Beyond lay darkness and the vast snow-covered wilderness, dangerous in its own right, but offering the promise of escape and ultimately safety for the child who had unexpectedly become the center of Mason Reed's world. As they emerged from the fort, a fresh volley of gunfire erupted from the main gate, Burke's men launching another assault. The distraction was perfectly timed for their escape. Mason led them down the gentle slope toward the tree line 300 yards away, keeping their pace deliberate to minimize noise and disturbance of the snow. Just as they reached the protective shadows of the pines, a shout came from the fort's eastern wall. A figure pointed in their direction, then disappeared from view, undoubtedly raising the alarm. They've spotted us, Wilson hissed. We need to move faster. Mason urged his horse forward, one hand protectively cradling Emma as they increased. In their pace, the moonlight cast enough illumination to navigate, but the terrain was treacherous. Deep snow drifts in some areas, icy patches in others. Mason led them along a winding path that utilized natural features for concealment where possible. Behind them, more shouts carried on the still night air. The pursuit had begun sooner than Mason had hoped. They'll have fresher horses, Winters observed anxiously. We can't simply outrun them. We don't need to outrun them, Mason replied, guiding them toward a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcroppings. We just need to outsmart them. The path he chose grew increasingly difficult to follow, a game trail barely visible beneath the snow, winding through dense trees and around massive boulders. It was slow going, requiring careful navigation, but it offered crucial advantages. Their pursuers would struggle to follow their exact route, and the rocky terrain would minimize tracks. Emma woke as they navigated a particularly steep section, startled by the movement and unfamiliar surroundings. She began to whimper, working toward a cry that would carry dangerously in the quiet night. Mason shifted her slightly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy now, little one. I know it's strange, but you're safe. I've got you." To his relief, Emma responded to his voice, her cries subsiding to occasional whimpers. Wilson watched this interaction with an expression Mason couldn't quite interpret, something between surprise and reluctant approval. "You've developed quite a bond with her," Wilson observed as they continued through the pass. Mason didn't immediately respond. The attachment he felt to Emma had grown so gradually he'd hardly noticed its development until now, faced with the possibility of losing her. "She needed someone," he finally said, unconsciously echoing his earlier statement. "After a while I realized I might need her too." Before Wilson could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them, multiple riders moving quickly through. "The forest behind them. They're gaining," Winters warned. Mason assessed their position. They'd covered less than 3 miles from the fort, not nearly far enough to shake determined pursuers. "The creek," he decided, pointing ahead. "We'll follow it upstream to the falls. There's a cave system behind the cascade, unknown to most." "Will the horses fit through the entrance?" Wilson asked. "No," Mason admitted. "We'll have to continue on foot from there." The strategy was risky but necessary. They reached the creek minutes later, its surface partially frozen but with a channel of flowing water at the center. Mason led them into the shallow water, where their horses' hooves would leave no tracks in the snow. "Keep to the water," he instructed. "Single file, minimize splashing." They progressed slowly upstream, the cold water reaching halfway up their horses' legs. Emma, disturbed by the increased movement, began to fuss again. Mason adjusted the sling to keep her higher and drier, murmuring reassurances. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, then suddenly stopped. Their trackers had reached the point where the horses' trail disappeared into the creek. "They'll split up," Wilson predicted tensely. "Search both directions along the water." "We're almost there," Mason encouraged, pointing ahead where the creek narrowed and the sound of falling water became audible. The waterfall came into view, a 20-foot cascade, partially frozen at the edges, but with water still flowing freely at the center. Mason guided them to a narrow bank on the western side, where they dismounted. "Take only what's essential," he ordered, securing his rifle and a small pack of supplies. "The cave entrance is narrow. We'll have to move quickly." As Winters and Wilson gathered critical items, Mason carefully adjusted Emma in the sling to ensure she was secure for climbing. The infant stared up at him with wide, solemn eyes, as if somehow understanding the gravity of their situation. "It'll be all right," he promised her softly. "I won't let anything happen to you." The sincerity of his promise surprised even him, a commitment deeper than duty, stronger than obligation. Somehow, this abandoned child had broken through barriers he'd maintained for years, awakening protective instincts he'd forgotten he possessed. Shouts echoed from downstream. Their pursuers had found their direction and were closing in rapidly. "This way," Mason urged, leading them toward an almost invisible path that wound behind the cascade. Blackwater Mission glowed like a beacon of warmth against the frigid night. The modest collection of log buildings had served as a religious outpost and way station for travelers for over a decade, operated by Reverend Thomas Reynolds and his wife Martha. Tonight, it had transformed into an impromptu military headquarters. Mason limped through the mission's gate, his injuries and exhaustion finally catching up with him. The courtyard bustled with activity, soldiers securing the perimeter, horses being tended, messengers preparing to ride to Fort Laramie with urgent dispatches. Colonel Hamilton walked beside him, issuing occasional orders to passing officers. "Burke's remaining men scattered into the hills," Hamilton reported. "Lieutenant Parker is organizing search parties for First Light." Mason nodded, but his attention was fixed on the main building ahead, where lamplight spilled from the windows. Somewhere inside was Emma. The mission's central hall had been converted into a temporary infirmary and command center. Maps were spread across tables, officers huddled in strategic discussion. Several wounded soldiers from the fort were being tended on makeshift cots along one wall. Mason scanned the room, his heart accelerating when he didn't immediately spot Emma. A gentle hand touched his arm. Martha Reynolds, the Reverend's wife, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and practical demeanor. "The little one is this way," she said, correctly interpreting his concern. Dr. Winters thought it best to keep her away from the commotion. She led him to a small side room that served as the mission's library. Dr. Winters sat in a rocking chair near a crackling fireplace, Emma cradled in his arms. The infant was wrapped in fresh blankets, her face peaceful in sleep. "Read," Winters acknowledged softly, rising from the chair. "She's perfectly fine. No signs of cold exposure or distress." Mason moved forward, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. Relief washed through him so powerfully it nearly buckled his knees. "Would you like to hold her?" Winters offered, already transferring the sleeping infant to Mason's arms. The familiar weight of her settled something in Mason's chest that had been tight since they'd fled the fort. Emma stirred briefly, her small hand emerging from the blankets, to grasp reflexively at his shirt before she settled back into sleep. "You should let me examine those wounds," Winters noted, eyeing the dried blood on Mason's face and arm. "Later," Mason replied, unable to contemplate releasing Emma just yet. Martha Reynolds smiled understandingly. "There's a bedroom through that. A door. You can rest there with the child while Dr. Winters tends to your injuries." The small bedroom was simply furnished, but warm and comfortable. Mason settled carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding Emma. Winters followed with his medical supplies, joined shortly by Wilson. "Burke's trail leads north," Wilson reported, closing the door behind him. Hamilton ordered a telegraph, sent to Fort Laramie, requesting additional troops to intercept him. Winters began cleaning the gash on Mason's arm. "And the documents? Secure with Colonel Hamilton. He's organizing an escort to deliver them directly to Washington." Wilson's expression was grim, but satisfied. "James's evidence will finally reach the right authorities." Emma stirred as Winters worked, her small face scrunching momentarily before relaxing again. Mason adjusted her position slightly, the movement so natural now it required no conscious thought. "What happens to her?" he asked quietly, voicing the question that had haunted him since Wilson's arrival. A heavy silence fell over the room. Wilson moved to the small window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. "She's my niece," he said finally. "My only remaining family." Mason nodded, the expected answer still landing like a physical blow. Of course Emma would go with her uncle, her blood relative, her rightful guardian. It was the proper outcome, the one he should want for her. The ache spreading through his chest had nothing to do with his physical wounds. "I've been thinking about that," Wilson continued, turning back from the window. "About what's best for Emma?" Winters finished bandaging Mason's arm and moved to clean the cuts on his face. "She'll need stability after everything she's been through." "Exactly," Wilson agreed. "She's already lost both parents, been uprooted, endangered, forced to flee through wilderness in winter." He met Mason's gaze directly. "And through all that, chaos, she's formed an attachment to you, Reed. Anyone can see it." Mason remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge the hope flaring to life within him. "My life isn't conducive to raising a child," Wilson continued. "I work for the Treasury Department, travel constantly, live in boarding houses between assignments." He sighed heavily. "I'm not what Emma needs right now." "What are you suggesting?" Winters asked. Wilson approached the bed, looking down at his sleeping niece. "I'm suggesting that sometimes family isn't just about blood." He touched Emma's cheek, gently with one finger. "It's about who's willing to reorganize their entire existence to care for someone who needs them." Mason finally found his voice. "You're her uncle, and I'll always be her uncle," Wilson agreed. "But right now she needs consistency, security. She needs the person she's bonded with." His expression softened. "She needs you, Reed." The door opened before Mason could respond. Colonel Hamilton entered, accompanied by Reverend Reynolds, a tall man with a practical manner that matched his wife's. "How is our youngest guest?" Hamilton inquired. "Resilient," Winters replied. "Like her caretaker." Hamilton nodded approvingly. "I've spoken with Fort Laramie. General Sullivan is dispatching troops to secure the area and hunt down Burke. More importantly, he's appointed a trusted officer to take the documents directly to Washington." "What about General Harrington and the others implicated in the scheme?" Wilson asked. "Arrest warrants are being prepared," Hamilton confirmed. "This goes beyond simple corruption, Mr. Wilson. The deliberate targeting of a child makes it something far more serious." Reverend Reynolds stepped forward. "Colonel Hamilton has explained the situation to me. The mission will remain under military protection until this matter is resolved." "And Fort Callaway?" Mason asked. "Secure," Hamilton assured him. "Burke's assault was repelled with minimal casualties. Sergeant Miller sends his regards and reports that Mrs. Blackwood is particularly eager to know that Emma is safe." The mention of Sarah brought a slight smile to Mason's face. She had been Emma's first champion at the fort, the one who'd insisted that the child needed more than mere sustenance. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Hamilton continued, his tone becoming more formal. "The child's future." Wilson straightened. "I've been discussing that with Reed. As Emma's uncle, I have certain legal rights regarding her guardianship." Hamilton nodded. "Indeed. I've consulted with Judge Morrison at Fort Laramie by telegraph. He's prepared to recognize your authority in this matter." "Good," Wilson said firmly, "because I've made my decision." He turned to Mason. "I want you to continue as Emma's guardian, Reed, with my full support and legal blessing." A stunned silence filled the room. Mason looked down at Emma, still peacefully sleeping in his arms, unaware of the life-altering conversations happening around her. "Are you certain?" Hamilton asked Wilson. "This is an unusual arrangement." "I'm certain," Wilson confirmed. "These are unusual circumstances. Emma has already formed a bond with Reed. Separating them now would only cause her more trauma." "And you, Reed," Hamilton inquired, "are you willing to accept this responsibility?" Permanently, the question struck Mason as almost absurd. In the months since Emma had appeared at Fort Callaway's gate, she had become the center of his world, the reason he returned from scouting missions, the reason he'd begun speaking to others again, the reason the frozen parts of himself had slowly started to thaw. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Reverend Reynolds smiled approvingly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. A child abandoned at a fort's gate finds a father in the most unlikely of guardians." "There will be practical matters to arrange," Hamilton noted. "Your duties at the fort and proper accommodations for raising a child." "Actually," Mason said, surprising himself with the clarity of the decision forming in his mind, "I've been considering leaving the army." Hamilton's eyebrows rose. "After all these years, what would you do?" "The Richardson property near Bison Creek has been vacant since the old man passed last spring," Mason replied. "Good land, sturdy house. Far enough from the fort to start fresh. Close enough to maintain connections." He glanced at Wilson. "A place where an uncle could visit regularly." Wilson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Sounds ideal." "The army would lose its best scout," Hamilton observed, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "I'm not much use as a scout anymore," Mason admitted. "Not since I started putting down roots." Emma chose that moment to wake, her blue eyes blinking open to take in the unfamiliar surroundings. She studied the faces around her before settling on Mason's, her expression brightening with immediate recognition. Her small hand reached up, grasping at his beard as she had done countless times before. "See," Wilson said softly, "she knows where she belongs." The next 2 weeks at Blackwater Mission passed in a blur of activity. Burke remained at large, but his threat diminished as troops from Fort Laramie secured the region. Mason's wounds healed under Dr. Winter's careful attention. The physical scars already fading faster than those he'd carried inside for years. Word arrived from Washington that Captain James Wilson's evidence had created a political earthquake. Several high-ranking officials had been arrested discreetly in pre-dawn raids at their homes. Newspaper headlines screamed of unprecedented military corruption and betrayal at the highest levels. Mason paid little attention to these developments. His focus narrowed to Emma and their future. The Richardson property had been secured through a banker in the nearest town, purchased with Mason's accumulated army pay, money he'd had little reason or opportunity to spend during his solitary years. Wilson remained at the mission, dividing his time between assisting Colonel Hamilton with the ongoing investigation and getting to know his niece. The initial awkwardness between him and Mason gradually evolved into something resembling mutual respect. "You know," Wilson remarked, one evening as they sat on the mission's porch, watching the sunset, Emma playing with a wooden toy between them. James would approve of this arrangement. Mason glanced at him questioningly. "My brother valued authenticity above all else," Wilson explained. "He'd appreciate that his daughter found someone who genuinely wants to raise her, not someone who feels obligated by blood ties." Mason nodded, thoughtfully. "Tell me about him, about both of them." Emma should know who her parents were. Wilson looked surprised by the request, then grateful. For the next hour, he shared stories of his brother and Elizabeth, how they'd met at a military ball in St. Louis, their whirlwind courtship, James's dedication to principles that ultimately cost him his life. He was investigating supply discrepancies when he stumbled onto the larger scheme, Wilson explained. Couldn't let it go, even when he realized how dangerous it was becoming. Elizabeth begged him to drop it, but he trailed off with a sad smile. James was nothing if not tenacious. "Like his daughter," Mason observed, as Emma determinedly crawled toward a leaf that had blown onto the porch, ignoring all distractions. Wilson chuckled. "Indeed. Poor Elizabeth used to say she was outnumbered by stubborn Wilsons." His expression sobered. "She was extraordinary, you know. When James was killed, she didn't fall apart. She calculated, planned, protected both the evidence and her child, rode for days with Emma to reach Fort Callaway, then continued alone to draw pursuit away from her daughter. The sacrifice of these people he'd never met, who had entrusted their most precious possession to fate and the kindness of strangers, weighed heavily on Mason. "I'll make sure Emma knows their courage," he promised. "Their principles." Wilson nodded, visibly moved. "That's all I could ask for." When it was time to depart for the Richardson property, now the Reed homestead, the mission organized a small send-off. Reverend and Mrs. Reynolds presented Emma with a handmade quilt to replace the one that had been dissected for its hidden documents. Colonel Hamilton provided an escort of trusted soldiers to accompany them to their new home. "The Army's loss is that child's gain," Hamilton told Mason privately as they prepared to leave. "But should you ever wish to return to service, there will always be a place for you." Mason thanked him sincerely, though they both knew he wouldn't be returning. The path ahead had been irrevocably altered by a small bundle left at a fort's gate at dawn. Sarah and Jenkins Blackwood surprised everyone by announcing their intention to settle nearby. Jenkins has had his fill of military life, Sarah explained, and that child will need a proper woman's influence as she grows. The journey to Bison Creek took 3 days, traveling at a pace suitable for Emma's comfort. The valley revealed itself gradually as they descended from the foothills, a picturesque landscape of meadows bordered by pine forest, with a clear creek winding through its center. The Richardson cabin stood on a slight rise near a stand of aspens, offering views in all directions. Defensible position, Mason noted with approval, old habits dying hard. Beautiful home, Sarah corrected, already planning improvements as she surveyed the property. The cabin itself was sturdier than Mason had expected, 2 rooms with solid log walls and a stone fireplace. Richardson had been a bachelor, but unlike many solitary men, he'd maintained his property meticulously. The roof was sound, the windows intact, the well-kept garden plot waiting for spring planting. It needs work to accommodate a child, Mason acknowledged as they explored. A proper nursery, expanded kitchen. You'll manage, Wilson assured him. You survived Powder River and Ash Creek. Somehow, I think you can handle a little carpentry. The first night in their new home, Mason sat beside the fireplace, Emma asleep on his chest. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling flames and her soft breathing. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of renovations, with Jenkins and Wilson having volunteered their assistance. Sarah would help establish the household, teaching Mason the domestic skills he'd never needed during his years of military service. For now, though, in this moment of stillness, Mason allowed himself to fully absorb the reality of his transformed life. 3 months ago, he had been a man defined by absence of connection, of purpose beyond duty, of hope for anything beyond endurance. Now, the weight of this sleeping child anchored him to a future he couldn't have imagined. Welcome. Home, Emma, he whispered into the quiet room. February 1879. The winter of 1878-1879 proved harsh, just as Mason had predicted months earlier. Snow piled high around the expanded cabin, which now boasted a proper nursery, enlarged kitchen, and covered porch. Inside, warmth and life had replaced the austere functionality of the bachelor homestead. News arrived sporadically, carried by military couriers or travelers seeking shelter from the brutal weather. Burke had been captured attempting to cross into Canada, his remaining loyalists scattered or surrendered. The corruption case had expanded, with over 20 officials and contractors now facing charges. General Harrington had taken his own life, rather than face court-martial, while Major Caldwell awaited sentencing after testifying against his co-conspirators. Wilson visited twice despite the challenging travel conditions, bringing gifts for Emma and news from the wider world. His position with the Treasury Department had been elevated due to his role in exposing the corruption, though he seemed more interested in establishing his relationship with his niece than in career advancement. Emma thrived despite the confinement of winter. She mastered crawling with remarkable speed, exploring every corner of the cabin with determined curiosity. Her first tooth appeared in January, followed quickly by a second. Her auburn hair grew thicker, curling slightly at the ends, in a way that reminded Wilson painfully of Elizabeth. Mason discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed. The skills that had made him an exceptional scout, observation, adaptation, endurance, translated surprisingly well to caring for an infant. He learned to interpret Emma's different cries, to anticipate her needs before she became truly distressed, to maintain calm in the face of her occasional frustrations. Sarah visited daily despite the snow, bringing freshly baked bread and maternal wisdom in equal measure. Under her guidance, Mason established routines that provided structure for both himself and Emma. "You're a natural," Sarah remarked one afternoon, as Mason successfully soothed Emma through a particularly difficult teething episode. Who would have thought the solitary scout of Fort Callaway would have such a knack for fatherhood? Mason shook his head, still sometimes disbelieving of this turn his life had taken. Not me. Not anyone who knew me before. Perhaps that's because no one truly knew you, Sarah suggested gently, including yourself. Spring 1879, the Bison Creek Valley emerged from winter's grip in a riot of color. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows surrounding the homestead Mason had purchased with his army severance. The house itself had been transformed over the winter months, repaired, expanded, and modified to accommodate its unique inhabitants. Mason sat on the front porch, whittling a small wooden horse while keeping one eye on Emma, who was determinedly practicing her crawling in the grassy yard. At 8 months old, she had mastered movement with alarming speed, necessitating constant vigilance. "She'll be walking before summer's end," Sarah Blackwood predicted, emerging from the house with a tray of lemonade. She and Jenkins had settled on neighboring land, becoming an integral part of Emma's daily life. "God help us all when that happens," Mason replied with a wry smile. The sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Robert Wilson appeared around the bend in the road, accompanied by Colonel Hamilton. Both men visited regularly. Wilson, to maintain his connection with his niece, Hamilton, to keep Mason informed of developments regarding the corruption case. "They've made good time from the fort," Sarah observed, pouring additional glasses of lemonade. Emma noticed the visitors and let out an excited squeal, abandoning her crawling practice to sit up with her arms raised demandingly. Mason chuckled, setting aside his carving to retrieve her from the grass. "Always the little commander," he said affectionately, settling her on his hip as he moved to greet the approaching riders. Wilson dismounted first, immediately reaching for Emma with a broad smile. "There's my favorite niece. Have you been terrorizing your poor father today?" Mason still felt a warm jolt whenever someone referred to him as Emma's father. The legal adoption had been finalized 2 months earlier, with Wilson's full support and Judge Morrison's approval. The document hung framed in the house's main room, official confirmation of what had been true in his heart for months. Hamilton remained mounted, his expression suggesting his visit was more than social. "Read, I bring news from Washington." Mason nodded, having expected this. The investigation into the corruption network had been proceeding for months, with periodic updates reaching even their remote homestead. "General Harrington and 5 others have been convicted," Hamilton reported. "Major Caldwell turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency." Wilson's expression hardened at the mention of Caldwell, but he nodded in satisfaction. "Justice for James and Elizabeth at last." "And Burke?" Mason asked, the name still causing a protective surge when he considered how close the man had come to harming Emma. "Captured near the Canadian border 3 weeks ago," Hamilton confirmed. "He'll hang before summer's end." The knowledge that the immediate threats had been neutralized lifted a weight Mason hadn't realized he was still carrying. Emma would grow up safe, free from the shadows that had claimed her parents. "There's more," Hamilton continued, producing an official-looking envelope. "This arrived for you from the War Department." Mason accepted the envelope with a questioning look, adjusting Emma in his arms to open it one-handed. Inside was a formal letter bearing the Secretary of War's seal. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing his expression change as he read. "A commendation," Mason replied, somewhat bewildered. "And an offer of reinstatement with promotion to captain." "Deserved recognition," Hamilton noted. "The corruption you helped expose saved the government millions and restored integrity to military contracting." "Are you considering it?" Wilson asked carefully. Mason looked down at Emma, who was contentedly playing with a button on his shirt. Secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, he thought of the nightmares that had plagued him after Ash Creek, of the walls he had built around himself, of the solitude he had once believed was his only refuge. Then he thought of a small bundle left at a fort's gate at dawn, the unexpected. gift that had shattered his isolation and offered him a path to redemption he hadn't known he was seeking. "No," he said with absolute certainty. "My scouting days are behind me. I have more important trails to blaze now." Hamilton nodded, unsurprised. "I told them you'd say that, but the offer remains open, should you ever change your mind." The visitors stayed for dinner, a lively affair with Jenkins and Sarah joining them at the large oak table Mason had crafted over the winter. Emma sat in a high chair fashioned by Corporal Jackson, who occasionally visited from Fort Calloway with his wife. To justice served, Wilson proposed a toast, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," Sarah added, with a meaningful glance at Mason. And Emma. As twilight settled over the valley, Mason walked his guests to the gate. Wilson lingered behind the others, clearly wanting a private moment. "I received a letter from an attorney in St. Louis," he said once they were alone. "Elizabeth's family has established a trust fund for Emma's education. They want to meet her. Someday, when circumstances allow." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "She should know her mother's family as well. When she's older, perhaps we could visit St. Louis together." "I'd like that," Wilson agreed. "And Reed, I want you to know that I've never doubted my decision. Seeing you with her, how you've built this life for her." He gestured to the homestead, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. "James and Elizabeth would be grateful, as am I." The two men, who had once been adversaries, united now by their love for a child neither had expected to raise, shook hands with newfound understanding, before Wilson mounted his horse to join the others. Later, as evening settled over the valley, and the visitors departed, Mason sat in the rocking chair beside Emma's crib. The nursery had been his first renovation project, a sun-filled room with carefully crafted furniture and colorful quilts made by the women of Blackwater Mission. Emma fought sleep as she always did, her determined spirit evident even in this simple battle. Mason rocked gently, humming a tune his own mother had once sung to him long ago. "You know," he said softly, as her eyelids finally began to droop, "when you arrived at Fort Calloway, everyone thought you were the one who needed saving." He touched her soft auburn hair, marveling as he often did at how someone so small could have such an enormous impact. "But the truth is, little one, you saved me." Emma drifted into dreams, her small hand wrapped trustingly around his finger. Outside, the wind whispered through the new leaves, carrying the promise of summer and all the seasons to follow. Years they would navigate together, the solitary army scout and the child who had given him a new beginning. Epilogue. 1890. The Bison Creek Schoolhouse buzzed with excitement as students gathered for the year-end recitation. 11-year-old Emma Reed stood confidently at the front of the room, her auburn hair neatly braided, her blue eyes bright with intelligence as she delivered her historical presentation on the Wyoming Territory's path to statehood. Mason sat in the back row, pride evident in his expression, as he watched his daughter captivate the audience of parents, siblings, and neighbors. The shy, traumatized infant had grown into a self-assured young girl with her father's quiet strength and her biological parents' unwavering sense of justice. Beside Mason sat Robert Wilson, now a frequent visitor to the flourishing Reed homestead. His government position had evolved into an advisory role that allowed him more time with his niece. Their relationship had grown into a cherished one, with Emma eagerly absorbing her uncle's stories about the parents she would never know. "She has Elizabeth's gift for public speaking," Wilson whispered, as Emma fielded questions from her classmates with poised confidence. "And her father's principles," Mason added, noting how Emma had insisted on including the often overlooked contributions of Native American tribes in her presentation. The Bison Creek Valley had changed dramatically over the years. What had begun as Mason's isolated homestead had become the nucleus of a small but thriving community. The Blackwoods property adjoined his to the east, while other families, many former military, had gradually established homesteads throughout. The valley, Mason himself had evolved from the silent, haunted scout into a respected community leader, still quiet by nature but no longer defined by absence and isolation. He served as a deputy to the territorial marshal, his tracking skills now employed in maintaining peace rather than military reconnaissance. As Emma concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, Mason caught her eye across the crowded room. She beamed at him, that same radiant smile that had first cracked the ice around his heart when she was an infant. He returned it easily, the expression no longer feeling foreign on his features. Later, as they rode home together on the wagon, Emma chatted excitedly about her teacher's praise and her plans for summer projects. Mason listened attentively, offering occasional comments or questions, still sometimes amazed by the easy companionship they shared. "Papa," Emma said suddenly, using the name she'd called him since her first words, "Uncle Robert told me something interesting today." "Did he now?" Mason replied, curious about Wilson's frequent historical anecdotes. He said that sometimes the best families aren't the ones we're born into, but the ones we build together. She looked up at him, suddenly serious beyond her years. "Like us." Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your uncle is a wise man." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I wish I could have known my first parents, but I'm glad fate brought me to you." Mason guided the horses around a bend in the road, the Reed homestead coming into view ahead, expanded now to include a barn, workshop, and fenced pastures where horses grazed peacefully. The simple cabin had grown into a proper house, with dormer windows and a wraparound porch lined with Sarah's flower boxes. "Fate had help," he told Emma, recounting for perhaps the 100th time the story she never tired of hearing. How she had been left at Fort Calloway's gate at dawn, how a solitary army scout had unexpectedly found himself responsible for an abandoned infant, and how that child had given him a new beginning he'd never imagined possible. As the wagon approached their home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the valley that had witnessed their extraordinary journey from strangers to family. Mason Reed, once the silent, haunted scout of Fort Calloway, reached out to squeeze his daughter's hand, grateful beyond words for the unexpected path that had led them here, together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.